If I can ask everyone to please take their seats, we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. They'll be coming around with breakfast and coffee. Thank you. Thank you again. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome the USGLC's Nevada co-chair, Senator Richard Bryan, to kick us off this morning.
Well, good morning and welcome to breakfast. As you've been told, my name is Richard Bryan, and I have the honor of serving as a co-chairman of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, the Nevada Advisory Committee. Frank Fahrenkopf is the other co-chair, and Frank and I were fraternity brothers at the University of Nevada more than a half a century ago, and as you know, he's a former national chairman of the Republican Party and will be retiring this June as the first CEO of the American Gaming Association. I'm also delighted to be joining in with the Latin Chamber of Commerce here in Las Vegas, and Ramon Torres will be joining us as part of the moderating panel. And especially delighted to welcome back to our community Governor Tom Ridge, who was here about 5 years ago. And I'm telling you, those of you who were privileged to hear him at that time will be as impressed as all of us were who heard him when he was here some 5 years ago. This morning we're going to have a panel discussion and a very thoughtful, meaningful discussion on the importance of our diplomatic mission and the importance of funding the various aid programs that are part of that. It will be a bipartisan approach. We'll be breaking, I think, into two different aspects as I see it. One is the national security issue, and the other is the economic security issue. And I want to just say a couple words about that before I'm privileged to introduce Governor Miller. No program probably is as misunderstood. For something that constitutes about 1% of the national budget, when you go out and talk to the public generally, they have the impression that it must be a third or more of the national budget, and it is difficult for the public to understand how important that is. I can remember having many town hall meetings as a United States Senator and being asked about this question. What about this foreign aid? Why? And I said, well, let me give you an example. I said in June of 1947, George Marshall announced at the Harvard commencement what became known as the Marshall Plan. I said, what relevance does that have to me and to you? I said, I'm part of a first generation of Americans in the 20th century not to be involved in combat in Europe. My grandfather's generation fought in World War I. My father's generation fought in World War II. As a result of the Marshall Plan, we stemmed the advancing tide of communism, which had enveloped most all of Eastern Europe. We rebuilt those economies, and the world was better and safer for that. The challenges that we face today are different, with terrorism that are not sponsored by a particular state organization, but various tribal and other interests. But it's terribly important, and I emphasize that in terms of my own personal experience, which the generation that fought in World War II, Tom Brokaw tells us, was the greatest generation. I agree with that. I would say of the generation of which I am a part, the sons and daughters of that generation, we're the luckiest generation because what they did to make our country strong and the world a safer place to live. The other aspect of this is something that as governors, Governor Miller, Governor Ridge, and others, I think understand very well, and that is the economic component of this. 95% of the world's population lives outside of the United States of America. And the fastest growing segment of the world's economies are in these underdeveloped countries. Enormous opportunities for Americans to participate in that global trade. For us in Nevada, about 350,000 of our citizens are involved in enterprises that involve trade. And in the last 10 years, the growth in that segment is about 800%. As we search for the new paradigm of where we go in Nevada in building on the economic foundation that essentially has been driven by gaming for the last 70 years, where do we find a new catalyst to take us to the next level? Certainly expanding our trade opportunities, and Governor Sandoval will be going on a trade mission. I'm sure Steve Hill, who's going to be joining us on the panel, will be talking about that as well. So there's some enormous opportunities for us in Nevada in terms of our own employment opportunities. And let me just say, which is obvious, the great challenge is China, at least in this part of the 21st century. Both economically, politically, militarily, the Chinese get it. They are everywhere. They are everywhere, and their footprint is large in the undeveloped world as they're seeking to extend their global reach. Now it's my privilege to introduce Nevada's 26th governor, Bob Miller. Bob Miller has had a distinguished career in public service. He was a justice of the peace, the first district attorney in the history of Clark County to be reelected to that post. He has served as ably as lieutenant governor and as governor of our state. He holds a distinction which is unique to all of the governors in the 149-year history of our state. He is the only governor to have ever served for 10 years. He is my friend and a distinguished member in our community that continues to be active in so many different roles. So would you please give a warm welcome to our 26th governor, Governor Bob Miller.
Find the tab here so that I introduce the people I'm supposed to introduce. I've made a lifelong habit of following Dick Bryan. So when I learned that he was going to be the co-chairman of the Nevada Advisory Board for USGLC, I immediately signed up because, got to keep that record intact. So it's a pleasure to have him introduce me. And I want to begin by acknowledging some representatives we have here of our congressional offices. Charbaz Folger of Senator Reed's office is here somewhere. All right. Ashley Kerrigan of Senator Heller. Edith Fernandez, please. Edith Fernandez from Congressman Horsford. Ari Gooding of Congressman Heck. And Mike Naft of Congresswoman Titus. There he is. It's especially a pleasure for me to be here with our keynote speaker, Tom Ridge. The first time I ever met or saw Tom was at a national governors meeting after he'd been elected. And it wasn't at the beginning of the meeting, it was precedence of the meeting. I happened to be exercising, and he was in there exercising. I took a look at the new governor of Pennsylvania and said, that's a guy I never want to piss off. And over the years, working with him, I developed a great respect for the way he approached sensitive issues and the inclusive fashion in which he embraced all of his colleagues in addressing them. So when he was named by the president, I gave out a loud cheer. Of course, my wife was the only one in the house at the time, but she will attest to the fact that I thought it was an excellent appointment, and I'm really pleased to be able to be here with him again this morning. As all of you would know, and because of your direct involvement, I mean, the Nevada economy is directly linked to the global economy, and you can see it in the recessionary periods, but even if you look at the U.S. economy as a bigger picture, what happens in Japan affects our economy, what happens in the European Union has a direct effect on the economy. and it affects certainly Nevada, where a lot of our income comes from discretionary spending. I have the pleasure now of serving on the board of Wynn Resorts, for example, and International Game Technology, and so I'm directly aware of the statistics that relate to the gaming industry, our primary industry. And as all of you would suspect, our domestic market participation is diminishing to some degree, especially as we see more and more competition in other parts of the United States. So all of these properties, this one that we're in, the MGM Group, Caesars, Wynn, Sands, all of them, are really depending more and more on the international traveler. And in order to have the international traveler come here, they have to feel good about America, and we have to feel good about their country. So it's very important, these types of relationships that establish friendly, cooperative, not only in business but in social contexts throughout the world. If you look at the year 2011, Nevada exports were over $8 billion, and that represented 2,054 companies at that time. 89% of those were small or medium businesses, in other words, less than 500 employees, and that created thousands of jobs. After being governor, I got a chance to travel a little more. I'm a senior advisor at a group called Dutco Worldwide, and also in my other capacities, I've traveled to every continent except for the one where penguins outnumber people. I haven't really embraced the economic concept of that one yet. And in those, I've had the opportunity to meet with government leaders, all the way up to presidents and prime ministers, because once you leave America, the two big letters, E and X, that go before governor, disappear somehow. And so you're afforded the opportunity to go in and meet with people, and it's been a pleasure working with groups doing that or individually. And I see that Nevada has increased dramatically over the last several decades in its recognition, particularly here in Las Vegas. There was a time several decades ago when you could go abroad to some parts of the world and say Las Vegas, and they had some vague concept of what that might mean. Steve probably knows that firsthand from dealing with it now, but you can go anywhere, China like he's been, and I've been, any part of China, for example, and they will know. I've been to Siberia. I went in the summer, I'm not that dumb, and on behalf of the U.S. government, as I have to Bulgaria and Romania and the Republic of Georgia, and every place I've gone, they are familiar with Nevada. Now, they're primarily familiar with our primary business, but they also have a positive feeling relating from that. And so it's important, and that's why this U.S. Global Leadership Council is so important, to bring all 50 states individually and collectively together to embrace the concept of world peace and economic exchange. So I'm honored to be a part of today. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here, with two former governors, one I've worked with and one I follow around. And at this point in time, I'd like to bring up from the national office, the policy director of U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, Dr. John Glenn. He said I should say he's not the real John Glenn. I think you probably all figured that out, but he's the more important one for this morning for sure. Dr. Glenn.
Good morning. That question about whether or not I'm the real John Glenn comes up a lot, but I trust you, I am real. But I am here and really want to thank you all for the time you've spent coming to be with us today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here in Nevada. It's a privilege to co-sponsor this morning's event with our partners, the Las Vegas the Latin Chamber of Commerce. And I want to thank you for taking your time out of your busy days to come and be with us today. I want to start as well by adding a note of thanks to our Nevada Host Committee. Again, Senator Bryan, Frank Fahrenkopf from the Nevada American Gaming Association. We couldn't do what we do without their support. They're joined by many Nevadan faith-based business, retired military leaders who really are some of our key voices here, and we've been really grateful for them in lending their support. And as I thank you for coming, I hope you've all had a chance to say hi to my colleague, Megan Nathan, who's leading our workout here. Megan's crackerjack, and I think she's looking forward to working with each and every one of you. So if I can, I'd like to take just one moment to tell you a little bit about who we are. Some of you may know, you may have been with us in 2008, but it's a good chance to sort of talk a little bit more about who we are. We're often known by something the Washington Post Deb Duss once, the Strange Bedfellows Coalition. When I introduce us, I always say we are a group of businesses and humanitarian organizations that have come together in support of understanding the need for U.S. leadership and engagement with the world. So we are Caterpillar, Coca-Cola, Cargill, Chevron, along with Bread for the World, Save the Children, and CARE. And it's those two groups coming together that have really in many ways embodied our commitment to understanding why we as Americans need to stay engaged in the world. We are blessed, I keep pushing backwards, excuse me. We are blessed by a bipartisan advisory council. It's led by General Colin Powell. We are fortunate enough to have every living Secretary of State from Henry Kissinger to recently Hillary Clinton. You'll see up there many faces you'll recognize, including Governor Ridge, who's with us today, Bob Gates, but a really extraordinary group of people who come together and support our works of understanding that this is an issue that is important for all Americans. We're particularly proud in recent periods with our support from the military community. We have a group of now over 125 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals from all branches of the military who lend their support for understanding the importance of the civilian side of our national security. Furthermore, once we did this work, we realized that it wasn't just the brass tops that understood, but it was veterans of all ages and ranks who understood that today's problems don't just have a military solution. We need to use all the tools of national power. And we started a group here called Veterans for Smart Power, which now has nearly 30,000 veterans from across the country who've really come together for our work, which is an extraordinary group. There's a Facebook page for those of you who do that. You should check it out. Now, who are we? We stand for the importance of a strong U.S. role in the world and for understanding the importance of engagement. It's a belief that a small but strategic investment, as we like to say, just 1%, in global health, agriculture, economic development diplomacy, is not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. Why is that? Look, we live today, as everybody knows, in an interconnected world. This is a world where infectious disease and terrorism know no borders. This is no longer the Cold War world of red and blue, of a battle between strong areas, but it's a problem of weak and fragile states, actually, where the health and education and economic futures of other people throughout the world are linked to what happens here on our own soil. And where events across the globe, from a fruit cart vendor in Tunisia setting himself on fire to protest a lack of economic opportunity, or a child dying of AIDS in Africa, can have an impact each of us right at home. So we were first here in 2008, and we talked about smart power. This is a concept that we liked because, as we like to say, it's not the military alone, and it's not the soft side, the development and diplomacy alone, but it's how you use them together to deal with today's global challenges. This is a strategy that we say requires a strong and effective development diplomacy alongside our defense. It requires a small but strategic investment in foreign assistance. But since 2008, as you know, already, the world changes quickly, and the landscape has changed dramatically. We've taken to what we talk about now with Smart Power 2.0. When we started, it was easy to say that since 9/11, everyone understands that what happens in other parts of the world affects us at home. And those national security threats are no less pressing now. But we're talking as well today about the economic impact. We're talking about how 95% of the world's consumers live outside America, which means we must stay engaged if we're going to be able to compete in the world. The good news is that when we look at what these programs, what diplomacy and development do, they do both of these. They advance our national security, they promote our economic prosperity, and on the economic side, by helping to build the enabling conditions for private investment, for American businesses abroad. They promote transparency, rule of law, the kinds of things that enable our businesses to compete. Now, if you will, each of you on your chair has a small little so-called key ring here. I'd urge you, when you get a moment, to take a look at that. There are some examples that can make concrete just some of the ways that we're making a better, safer world. It's support for our allies. It's helping children. It's helping promote agriculture in some, I think, remarkably new ways that really highlight the way that we've tried to make sure that the work that we do today is accountable, effective, and transparent. So there's a lot that can be said about this, and I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion. We're looking forward to engaging you. On your tables, I hope you'll notice there's some cards there with and little pencils. If you'd like to prepare some questions during the discussion, I really encourage you to do so. But let me once again thank you for joining us. This is really critical that we have, your involvement in understanding how we are working to try and build a better, safer world. So to bring this here, however, to Nevada, please let me welcome to the program, to the podium, Carlos Silva from the World Affairs Council of Las Vegas. Thank you, Carlos.
Good morning. I am Carlos Silva, a proud veteran of the United States Army, and I'm honored to be here among all of you. From my time spent in service to our country, I have seen firsthand the importance of maintaining the strength of America's armed forces. I'm proud to be a part of the USGLC's Veterans for Smart Power, representing nearly 30,000 veterans and supporters who share a commitment to elevating and strengthening our non-military tools of global engagement alongside our military so we can build a better, safer, more prosperous America and world. I now speak for many in the military, including many of my fellow veterans here today, who agree that our national security cannot depend on the military alone. These men and women have served on our front lines defending our security and our deepest held values. They deserve our deepest appreciation and our support for their service to our nation. I would like to ask all of the veterans and active duty personnel in attendance to please rise so we can salute you. Thank you. I have also come to see that America's civilian-led tools of diplomacy and development are critical components of our national security strategy. We don't need to look very far to find evidence of how global engagement impacts us right here in Nevada. In 2011, Nevada exported over $8 billion in goods and services to foreign countries from over 2,500 companies. Of these, 89% were small and medium-sized enterprises with fewer than 500 employees. Working closely with other state organizations, we have helped create new export opportunities and expand overseas direct investment, which has led to thousands of jobs right here in Nevada. But don't just take my word for it. We have asked a top-notch team of experts to lay out the case for today's discussion in more detail. Let's watch.
With our economy the way it is today, some people are asking why we're spending so much money overseas and not on creating jobs right here at home. Well, actually, we're not spending much money. Just 1% of our national budget goes to the international affairs budget. That's not a lot. And helping create American jobs is just what that money's doing. If you want to create jobs, you have to create more demand for products and services. You need more customers.
And where are American companies finding more customers?
Not here, but here. And here.
And here.
95% of the world's customers live outside the U.S.
95%.
When we sell goods to them, they're called exports. U.S. exports accounted for a big part of our economic growth last year.
Half went to developing countries.
And their economies are growing 3 times faster than developed countries. And every 10% increase in exports equals a 7% increase in jobs here.
So, how do we increase exports?
Build new markets for American goods and services.
Remember that 1%?
America's international affairs budget helps fund programs
That improve health and education.
supports agriculture development, builds a stable economy,
And creates new markets. So if we don't go to the biggest, fastest growing group of consumers,
other countries will.
other countries already are.
Investing a small amount in global development and diplomacy
It's not only the right thing to do,
it's also the smart thing to do.
to make our economy stronger. To create more jobs.
For my mom,
For my dad.
or my neighbor.
For me.
Aren't you hopeful for the future after watching that? Well, I'm definitely. I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. There's no one who encapsulates all of these more than our honored guest, former Pennsylvania Governor and the first Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge. He's also a veteran of the Vietnam War, where he attained the rank of Staff Sergeant with the United States Army. As a trusted advisor to the USGLC and co-chair of this year's PES Impact 2012 campaign, Governor Ridge has been a critical voice around the country and on Capitol Hill in support of a strong and effective smart power foreign policy. We are extremely grateful to have him here with us this morning. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our Governor, Tom Ridge.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much for your very warm reception. Good morning, all. It's a great pleasure to join you. To my colleagues, Senator, when we served way back, it seemed like quite some time ago, I like to think that the environment was more conducive to compromise and getting things done. So it's a great pleasure to be in your company. And to my friend, the Gov, I got to tell you, you told a story about Governor Ridge. I'm going to tell you one about my friend, Governor Miller. Governor Miller hosted, every year, the chairman of the National Governors Association hosts an event. And obviously, he hosted the NGA event here in Las Vegas. And at the time, I don't think either one of my children had hit double digits. They were still very young. And so the governors and the families invited. And we were here for 3 or 4 days. And I dare say, if after the 3 or 4 days we were here, if you had taken a poll among the kids who were here in Las Vegas as to who their favorite governor was, their fathers would have come in second and Bob Miller would have come in first. They had a heck of a time. They had a heck of a time. Let me thank you for taking the time this morning. It's an important conversation. It's an important gathering. I think the coalition appreciates the strength of the organization and the financial and political support from all of you in the room. Obviously, we're always looking for more of both. We're grateful to have your attention and your ear this morning. I've been privileged to be associated with this group since shortly after I left public service, and for several reasons. First of all, I am, and perhaps most importantly, I buy into both the mission of the organization and the message. Think about it, if you will. Global leadership. Very powerful words. Very powerful image. And you put the United States in front of both of those words, and frankly, I just believe that that is a role and responsibility that whether we like it or not, and candidly in many political circles, global leadership on both sides of the aisle in different dimensions is not something that is warmly embraced. But if the United States doesn't take upon itself the responsibility to lead, who else does? And if the United States, with its value system, doesn't take upon the responsibility to lead in terms of promoting freedom and democracy and liberty, who else does? We have the history, we have the mission, and I would say we have the responsibility. I must also say that there's probably an expectation around the world that we accept that mission and that responsibility. But global leadership can be very controversial. We have some folks on our side of the aisle that think we ought to withdraw from the rest of the world. We ought to, it's not political isolationism, but it gets pretty close. Let the world do as they will, and we'll get involved occasionally. There's another, on the other side of the aisle, they're economic protectionists. We don't want to be engaged. They're worried about, they don't appreciate the opportunities that exist in the world economy. And so whether you're an economic protectionist or you're a political isolationist, you have concluded that it's in America's best interest to withdraw from the rest of the world. I don't know of anyone who, well, obviously they do. I don't know how anyone thinking about America's future in an interconnected global community can think that America's interest, and it's okay if we do things in America's interests. You can do good and well at the same time. How in the world in the 21st century can it be in America's interest to be less engaged in the rest of the world? How can we pull back when we're now more connected? We're more interconnected, more mutually dependent. Frankly, the security of the world and the economy of the world are interconnected, just like in the United States. Our national security and our national economy are interconnected. You can't have a secure world, you can't have a secure America without a strong economy, you can't have a strong economy without a strong defense. They are interconnected, security and prosperity, in the United States and the rest of the world. So when I say U.S. global leadership, I say to myself, we accept the responsibility. There are many reasons that I think we are responsible. We should take on that obligation to lead in many areas around the world. But it is also in our interest to be more engaged and not less engaged. Forevermore. A lot of young people here, and I've always thought that politics and government was about tomorrow. Those of us who have been privileged to serve in public life, whether you're senator, governor, whatever, you make the decisions, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, you make decisions, depending on your philosophy, around the notion that what you're trying to do is make sure that the tomorrows for your constituents, the tomorrows for your citizens are better than today's and yesterday's. And frankly, the young people have more tomorrows before them than yours truly. Don't laugh, many of you too. So when I take a look at U.S. global leadership and the coalition, the unique coalition that's been formed, their goal in this one and very important dimension in talking about smart power is to promote the notion that if we can use the effective tools, they call it the wise arsenal of liberty, to advance our interest, also consistent with our brand, consistent with our heart, consistent with our DNA. It is in our best interest to do so. And hopefully in doing so, there will be better tomorrows. For not only for us, but if there's safer, more secure, and more prosperous tomorrows for the rest of the world, the benefit inures to us as well. So at the end of the day, when we talk about how America can influence events, we know clearly we've got the strongest, most sophisticated, most expensive military in the world. And regardless of what you think of our foreign engagements in other parts of the world, we have to admit that one of the lessons from Vietnam we've learned is we've learned to distinguish the war from the warrior. And we have to be grateful as a country that so many men and women today, but for 200 plus years, have gone on perilous parts of the world, sacrificing oftentimes their own lives to advance our interests. That's one way you influence. But you also have diplomacy, and you have foreign assistance. So at the end of the day, the mission of the coalition is make us safer and more secure. We all want that. To promote economic development. We all want that. And the third, it's pretty difficult to articulate. The third reason we should do it is because it's the right thing to do, in my judgment. Because we are the United States of America. Probably the most blessed country in the history of the world in terms of people, resources, technology. So we accept that responsibility. At least I think we should. And when you think about the military, I can't help but go back and thinking in my terms of when I was a young staff sergeant in Vietnam, 22 years old. I got to tell you, I wasn't terribly interested in the nature of global engagement at the time. So my images of the time have less to do with foreign policy, but they have a lot more to do, and I can close my eyes right now and see it, with certain elements of human dignity and the work ethic of the peasants in Vietnam, kind of woven through this incredible, almost unbearable landscape of war, while they tried to eke out a living. No, try to eke out survival. And so in retrospect, you go back and you wonder, was democracy important to them? Was food on the table? Were elections important to them? The institutions as we know as civil society important to them? Or they have a ride a bicycle to get up and down Highway 1 or through those? So you always wonder. I've always wondered. Had we stayed, and obviously we pulled out, but the military is just one arm of our arsenal, but there's a wiser and smarter arsenal, and that's diplomacy and foreign assistance. Diplomacy, I for years have thought that one of the things that neither Republican nor Democrat administrations have done is placed more emphasis in building the Consular Affairs Office, the Economic Affairs Office in our embassies around the world. You really do need to tie, if you can tie the economies together, if you can tie countries together, their mutual economic benefit, the chances are you'll create a more stable economic environment, hopefully longer term, and you'll create relationships. Hopefully, as my friend Jack Kemp used to say, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if you can help create a more stable environment, if you can help reduce the level of poverty, if you can do those kinds of things, and if you could get U.S. corporations bringing a certain ethic and quality of work to different parts of the world, and I've always thought we've fallen short by not advancing the notion that our diplomatic corps should have more consular affairs office dealing strictly with economics. Part of the international affairs budget kind of beefs up not so much the State Department, but understands, the Global Coalition understands the connectivity on the economic side. You saw that great video of the kids? You know the numbers. 95% of the world lives out, 95% of the markets outside the United States. 1 out of 5 jobs is related to exports. 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa and emerging countries. I think 10 out of 15 strongest economies in the world are significant beneficiaries of foreign assistance that we've given over the years. It makes sense. Not because it just ties us economically, but it makes sense. Stable countries with enhanced economic opportunity that is spread across the countryside provides less of an attractive environment for those who would potentially undermine those countries or perhaps try to undermine ours. And foreign assistance. Let's face it, folks, foreign aid, next to executive compensation, might be the most volatile and controversial vote in Washington, D.C. I mean, I just reject that notion. Well, we've got so many problems in America. How can we send money over to overseas? And I say it's a strategic investment that benefits the United States of America. That's why you invest. That's why that line item, international affairs, this year I think it's like 1.4%. Oh, by the way, the budget this year that President Obama submitted, hold on to your hats, sit in your seats, $3.8 trillion, ladies and gentlemen, $3.8 trillion. International affairs budget, which deals with food assistance, deals with promoting human rights, deals with some health care assistance, a long list of things they do, is $52 billion. Now, I know in Erie, Pennsylvania, that's still a lot of money, but in comparison to nearly $4 trillion, it's a drop in the bucket. Compare it to what the national defense budget is, $600 billion plus. It is very, I don't want to say it's modest because it's a lot, but in the scheme of things, it's nothing compared to the benefit that inures to us if we're prepared to make the investment. The word has been used from time to time, preemptive wars. Well, I think there's a reason to have a preemptive engagement before the war starts. We know how expensive wars are in blood and treasure. It's a bargain if we can create stable platforms in emerging countries where they look at the United States. Look, we have a big heart. Who is the first country that rushes to the aid of another part of the world when a natural disaster strikes? Tsunami in Indonesia, earthquake here, problems in Haiti. Who's the first country on the scene? The United States of America. Well, Global Coalition is saying, let's not wait until disaster strikes. Let's try to get in before it strikes. Let's try to build a stable society. And remember, before they're interested in democratic institutions of civil society, before they're interested in a ballot, they're interested in food, clothing, and shelter. I often thought about that. my time and my travels now around the rest of the world. But if you can help them deal with human needs, if they can identify the vaccination that their children received, the intervention by the United States in providing food, the dollars that go to start a school in the village, if those investments in them, in their quality of life, somehow enhance that quality of life, and they know who sent it over there, who is responsible for making their life a little bit better. You know, I often think of, it's a tough example to raise publicly, but I'm going to raise it anyway because I think it's true. You know, we managed to get troops from Israel out of southern Lebanon. We got Syria out of there, but that whole part of southern Lebanon, right now, is a hotbed for terrorism. They had elections in Lebanon, but there was a need for social assistance, medical assistance, just humanitarian aid, and that, you know who provided it? Iran. And Iran provided it to Hezbollah. And they provide food and clothing and jobs and schools and health care. Is it no wonder that it has become, frankly, a haven for terrorists? And you say to yourself, why, if our diplomacy was so successful there and we managed to pull the parties apart, we enabled them to have their first serious election, why weren't we there to help them address basic human needs? If we can provide sanitation, if we can provide clean water, if we can help them improve their agricultural productivity, and the list goes on and on and on. Oh yes, it very much improves their quality of life. But at the end of the day, it's the right thing for us to do, it's the smart thing for us to do, but the benefit is also ours. So we think about this, and I go back to that U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Powerful words, powerful image. What a difference the wise use of the tools of liberty, wise arsenal of liberty can make for the United States and its future. I know many of you have been very supportive of the Global Leadership Coalition over the years financially, and we want to say thank you. But put it all in perspective again. It helps make us more secure nationally. The forces of globalization have pulled this planet closer together, and it's going to get closer and closer over the years. We're more interconnected and more independent. And whether it's the global scourge of terrorism, if it's pandemics, it's organized crime, the list goes on and on, we're in this together. So we'll use the military when we have to, but I still like the notion of preemptive diplomacy and preemptive foreign assistance and development assistance. Because the ROI for your businessmen in the audience, the return on that investment is almost infinite if done wisely and smartly. And at the end of the day, I'm going to tell you something I truly believe in. And most people don't appreciate or understand this, and I don't say that to be critical. It's just my observation. The world expects us to lead, folks. Whether we like it or not, there's a certain expectation in the broader global community that we act. And others will follow. And so we act, it's in our self-interest, but I say this again and again, it's part of our DNA. We are the compassionate country. We are the first to arrive at the scene. We do care about how other people live. In midst of a moral crisis, humanitarian crisis, we dare not be neutral because that's not who we are. So again, I want to thank you for spending a little time here. I guess we're going to have a good conversation with this panel. It's always great to be. I really messed up my schedule. You know, I got in late last night and I'm leaving this afternoon. What's wrong with me? And by the way, my kids not only enjoyed it, Governor, the governor did. But I want to thank you for participating in what I consider to be an important conversation, and thank you for your continued support of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Thanks very much.
Morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm John Ralston. I'm pleased and honored to be moderating this distinguished panel for this great group. I will say that even before this panel discussion begins, we have a spectacular achievement here this morning. We had 3 former politicians speak, and we're almost on time.
All right, I'll screw that up.
Let me very quickly introduce the distinguished folks who have joined Secretary Ridge up here on this panel. Richard Bryan gave me a 20-page resume to read, but I'm only going to just give a couple of highlights. He, of course, was a 2-term governor, well, almost 2 terms, and then he went to the U.S. Senate. He's now on the Board of Trustees of the Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce, excuse me, and the NDA, the Nevada Development Authority. And he's also, as you already know, the co-chairman of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition's Nevada State Advisory Committee. Steve Hill, my good friend, is here. He serves in Governor Sandoval's cabinet as the Executive Director of Economic Development. It's easier just to call him the Czar of Economic Development for the state. He's also been a chairman of the Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce. And last but not least, Ramon Torres, who serves on the board of the Latin Chamber of Commerce. He also leads the Epicure Group International, which specializes in international trade and business development services through the Americas. Let's give a warm welcome to this panel first, please. We want this panel to be as interactive as possible, and there should be some cards on the table if you have questions or questions occur to you, and they will be passed up to me, and I will try to get as many of them answered as we can. But let me start the panel discussion with Senator Bryan. You heard Secretary Ridge talk about how global leadership is not always warmly embraced. And you've been in D.C., you've been a governor. Talk about how governors can help and get more warmly embraced the notion of global leadership.
Well, I think as Governor Ridge and as Governor Miller pointed out, governors get the economic component. They recognize the importance of being involved internationally through diplomatic efforts, obviously the visa programs, which are terribly important to those of us who come from states that are heavily dependent upon tourism. But governors understand the importance of the international engagement. I don't think there's probably a governor in the United States today that has not led or participated in some international trade mission. All of us as former governors here did so, and there's a recognition. And I think there's also a recognition at a time when the economy in America is struggling and how do we do something more, getting more people back to work. Clearly there's an international component, the potential of developing better ties in the international community gives us an opportunity for growth. I think there's an enormous potential there. Governors get that. I think they need to convey that message to our leaders in Washington.
Well, when you were governor, Governor Ridge, in Pennsylvania, you emphasized businesses exporting. Talk about some of that experience and how it helped in the goals that we're talking about today.
Well, when I had the privilege to serve as governor, we inherited, I think, 2 offices overseas, and frankly, we are interconnected. The global economy means we're more vulnerable to a lot of things, but there's even greater opportunities. So I think we expanded to like 7 or 8 offices, and we had a hub and a spoke. So we hired some people. We held them on performance measures as well, and they were responsible for regions. And it was hugely important for us, not so much with the big companies. I'm sure you're doing this in Nevada as well. You know, the big companies don't really need government to help them very much. Oh, every once in a while they tag along. But you take the small and medium-sized companies, and we used to brief them before we went overseas about culture, the do's and the don'ts. And I used to plead with them, don't go just to make a sale. Build a relationship. You want a long-term engagement in this part of the world or not. And it proved to be very successful. I never got a chance to measure it because I got the call from the White House. But it proved to be very successful. And you're right. We took 2 or 3 trade missions every year. We took 15 or 20 companies with us. Before they got off the plane, they knew. I mean, and here's was my reference to the Consular Affairs Office and the Economic Consular Affairs. Some of the embassies did a good job, and some of them did an awful job. But they all knew, regardless of the sources, when they got off the plane in that country, they're going to have 5 to 7 meetings. And we said, don't just try to sell your product. create a relationship, because you want the state to be tied in with that part of the world. And it proved to be very successful.
You want to name some of those embassies that did an awful job? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Mr. Hill, speaking of trade missions, you've already been on one to Asia, and talk about how that helps Nevada, how it projects a positive image of America. There are some positive things about Nevada, right? And talk about that trip and the benefits.
Well, I don't want to put too fine a point on how long it has been since Governor Bryan and Governor Miller were governors. But it has been since those two fine gentlemen were governors in this state that a governor has led a trade mission out of Nevada. And I think the state has experienced that vacuum. Just in some of the conversations with some of the members in the audience here today before breakfast, they were remarking that the kind of re-engagement of Nevada in the global effort is noticeable and important. As Secretary Ridge pointed out earlier, 95% of the market is outside of the United States. We approach this from trying to put Nevadans back to work. I mean, we're a piece of the Homeland Security issue, but our primary thought when we go to work every day is to put Nevadans back to work. That market out there is enormous. Obviously, the gaming and tourism industry is highly dependent on those global connections, and making those folks in other countries feel welcome, I think, is a part of a governor's job, and it's something that Nevada has started to re-engage on, and I think that'll be beneficial in our main industries and also in growing new ones.
You want to talk a little bit about that trade mission to Asia and how it went?
Yeah, absolutely. And we covered quite a bit of territory, took over a number of businesses with us. Secretary Ridge mentioned large companies don't need state government help. But it's a daunting prospect for a small and medium business to think about, where do I go? How do I find customers? The federal government the U.S. Commercial Service in particular, Select USA, provide that linkage that we can hook into and help those smaller companies really find customers, and that's happening. As Senator Bryan mentioned, everybody knows, and Governor Miller both mentioned, everybody knows Las Vegas. You can walk into an audience that can't speak the language you're speaking. If you say Las Vegas, their eyes light up. That provides a global connectedness that will probably never leave Nevada, which is a real benefit to build on. But getting out there and introducing those small and medium-sized companies to the markets that really are available to them is important.
Mr. Torres, I didn't mean to wait so long to get you involved in the conversation, but your business, you're involved in getting out there in the international community. Talk about Nevada's role as you see it in the global economy, and what you find when you're talking to folks outside the country.
Thanks, John. Well, I think there's tremendous potential for Nevada companies all over the world. We like to say that Las Vegas could be the portal or the gateway to trade in the Americas, because the brand of Las Vegas is so well known, as Steve was just mentioning, all over the world, especially in the Americas. And we have tremendous opportunity because of our airport to attract a lot of business. Los Angeles has Long Beach, San Diego has a seaport, Las Vegas has a tremendous airport with a lot of potential, and because of proximity to the Southwest area with Los Angeles and Phoenix and Utah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for Nevada companies. And there's even more so opportunity because we can only go up. We're ranked, I believe, 47th in the country in international trade productivity. So there's a lot that we can do to catch up. San Diego, for example, there was an article in the New York Times just this weekend. San Diego had its global trade conference. San Diego alone exports $17 billion, just San Diego alone. So there's a lot more that we can do. We need to tap into these resources and, again, capitalize on what we have, like McCarran Airport, and the fact that we're centrally located on the West Coast as a distribution center, for example, which is one of the things that Steve and his team are working on.
So tell me some of the other things you think. You said there's a lot more we can do. What more can we do? What more should we be doing?
Well, I think we need to look at the companies that are here already that are manufacturing and exporting, for example, and work with them, help them develop, which again is something that GOAT is working on. I think we've had more and this is speaking to Steve's efforts, we've had more developments in the last 12 to 16 months as far as international trade goes than ever before in the history of the state. And that's really exciting. When I looked around to try and find companies like mine that were involved in international trade professional services, I just couldn't find any, which is why we established the Insight Conference, which just took place last week, to create a platform, a forum for companies that needed that support to develop its international trade initiatives or efforts. So working with small companies, everybody said that the large companies don't need the support. It is a small to medium-sized business, sometimes mom and pop shops that need to find that new market. Through the Latin Chamber of Commerce, we also partnered with the International Trade Administration to launch the New Market Export Initiative through the Department of Commerce, which helps small to medium-sized businesses find those new markets outside of the U.S. It's going to be an effort that we're going to be pushing out along with the global Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance and Steve's office to, again, support those small businesses, particularly in Mexico and Canada. Proximity is everything. Location is everything. Being able to tap into those markets and those resources is going to be critical, especially when you look at countries like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, that have economies that are growing much, much faster than U.S. economy. They want American products. We need to connect that Nevada company with that consumer in those new markets.
So basically, it's all on Steve Hill's head. He's got to do everything.
Absolutely.
As long as we understand that. You know, I thought Secretary Ridge brought up maybe the most salient point. It speaks right to the raison d'etre of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which is people, especially during bad economic times, they don't want to talk about foreign aid. They don't have the perception is that foreign aid is way more a part of the budget than it actually is. And so, not just this group, but folks like. And let me start with you, Senator, then I'd like Governor Ridge to expound on this. How do you make that case if you're someone in elective office? Now, it doesn't matter whether you're a governor, a member of the House, or a senator. How do you make the case to your constituents that this is important?
Let me say it's difficult because there is that perception that is inaccurate that a substantial part of the budget is devoted to foreign aid. And compounding the felony, if you will, there are examples in which some of that foreign aid has been misused. There's rampant corruption in some of the countries that have been the beneficiary of that. So you add that and the fact that, by and large, there is a perception, look, let's take care of the problems at home. Now, I think Governor Ridge did try to make the argument in his keynote address that in being involved in the international community in terms of our economic self-interest. And I think one way that we can do that, John, is that everybody with a room temperature IQ, and that would include most of us who've been privileged to have served in public office, recognizes that one of the great challenges in the 21st century is China. Whether that challenge is military alone, economic dominance in terms of what they're doing, the fact that the Chinese are everywhere, that they are in these newly developed countries and they are there more aggressively than we, I think, frankly, the competitive juices in America by saying, look, in effect, the great competition that we're going to be facing in the 21st century, not some of the European adversaries that we've had in terms of our past history, but what's happening in Asia, and the Chinese are doing that, and if we don't get involved, we're going to lose a tremendous opportunity and may cede the leadership in the world to China, and I don't think any thoughtful American wants that to occur. Yeah. I think that linkage, John, could be helpful.
How many members of the media would you say have room temperature IQs, Senator?
John, all of those who wrote nice articles about me.
That's what I thought you would say. Well, let me ask you, Secretary Ridge, because if you look through that great key ring that's on the tables, you see all the wonderful things that foreign aid can accomplish. But the real problem is that the average American who is struggling to pay his or her mortgage, to keep his or her job, you say, oh, look, all this money we're spending to fight AIDS in Africa, they're going to shut down, aren't they? How do you make that case?
Well, sometimes, whether they buy into the case or not, you still have to vote for it. I mean, this notion that, you'd like to be able to make the case, you'd like to be able to explain, and if they're willing to listen, I think most reasonable people will conclude that it's, you can make a very solid case that it's in America's long-term best interest. Look, I mean, it's easy for me. It's a $4 trillion budget. We're talking less than 10% of what we spend on defense, less than 1.5% of what's in the budget. And if we can create a more stable environment in some of these emerging countries, which is a hotbed for terrorism, if we can reduce the likelihood, if we can manage the risk that because of the economic environment and the instability of those countries, it would be less likely that they will become a haven for global terrorism, for crime and the like. I've made the case, and I just think that sometimes, whether it's popular or not, if you think it's the right thing, you got to vote for it. I'd like to tell folks. Think about this for a moment. How many of you have ever seen Charlie Wilson's War, the movie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I served with Charlie Wilson. Now, I have no idea who those women in the bathtub were, or in the I had no idea who was in the hot tub with them. But think about this for a moment. The most poignant scene in that movie is at the end. And remember, those of you who've seen the movie, it's about America's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And one of the last scenes is that the Russian tanks are going across the bridge. They're getting out. And he's back in the Intelligence Committee arguing for money for roads and schools, etc. And one of his colleagues said, "Who do you think you are, the congressman from Kabul?" I don't know. Like I said, you wonder about Vietnam. Well, you wonder what happens if the Russians are out, we go in and start building roads. Again, understand it's a complex environment, but we didn't even think about going in with development assistance. Now, think how much money we have spent there since 2001. Think of the number of lives we've lost since 2001, and you tell me that it would have been worth X number of dollars to at least try to create an environment for the Afghan people, given the complexity of the tribal, given all the complexity. And that's what I say, and then people say, well, I'm not going to vote for you because you voted for this. I say, go ahead, fine, vote for somebody else. I think it's the right thing to do. And every once in a while, regardless of whether or not it's popular, you just got to do it.
John, if I might add a footnote to the governor's comment, our history indicates the consequences of not being involved. The
Good
history
point.
of the 20th century in Europe might well have been rewritten if the United States had joined the League of Nations, if the United States had provided some leadership in that interregnum between World War I and World War II. There might have been a huge difference. And in recent times, after our successful, we got the Russians out, had we continued, Mr. Secretary, to have been more involved in helping the Afghan people, perhaps the Taliban would not have reasserted itself. The fact that we, in effect, withdrew significantly at that point in time left the opportunity for the groups that we are now fighting to reassert themselves and to create continuing problems. So I would argue, John, that the absence of being involved has consequences that are dangerous to our national security as well.
Okay. I do have some questions from the audience here. I think I'm going to ignore the first one that it says that they have reliable evidence that a scene involving Governor Ridge in the hot tub was cut from that movie.
I'm the only one with a copy, so eat your heart out.
The first question I'd like both Mr. Torres and Mr. Hill to address vis-a-vis Nevada, and if either Secretary Ridge or Governor Bryan want to jump in, that's fine too. As a public school teacher, I'm concerned about the current state of education. How is education and its importance being addressed in global leadership? Which you gentlemen wants to go first? Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, if you look at what the U.S. talks about in the national security strategy, or really what we need to do in order to grow the economy in Nevada, you see two things over and over and over, and that's jobs and education, and they're linked. And certainly in Nevada, our education needs to improve. Both the school system and the output is going to be critical. And if you ask what is going to lead Nevada forward or keep America in the leadership position that we have, it is education. the ability to produce a high percentage of college graduates, which Nevada lags behind in and we need to improve. STEM jobs require employees that have that STEM education. It's a high priority for the governor. It's obviously something that we need real improvement in, and that's really the cornerstone of both economic development and, I think, national security.
To add to that, we all know that companies move when they need to move, not necessarily based on incentives. They move because of quality of life for their staff and continued development. And so education, higher education plays a critical role in that. So there's a direct tie-in between funding higher education with being able to stimulate the economy. We also look at what other countries, if we look at what other countries are doing in regards to connecting education with trade or with, for example, manufacturing. You look at Mexico as one example. They have programs starting at the junior high level that lead into the local trade initiatives that community might have. And I know we're making some steps forward in Nevada with that, but I think there needs to be a little bit more to connect trade and trade development, economic development with higher education.
Gentlemen, yeah, either of you want to jump in? No? I can move on. Another question from the audience, and maybe we can have the two former governors address this. Most of the U.S. economy is services, but there are fewer services being exported. How do we advance the export of services?
Well, let me just say briefly, tourism isn't exporting in terms of the balance. And this is something that's kind of difficult, I think, for a lot of people to grasp. When people come to the United States, spend money, that eases the balance trade problem that the country faces. So tourism is an enormous source of an export industry. And then for all the other reasons that have been expressed here, the opportunity for small and middle-sized businesses with the help of programs at the diplomatic level and the consular level can be very important to expanding business opportunities. And it looks to me like in this country we've got an opportunity to see a resurgence in manufacturing as well. And so there's tremendous opportunities. There's actually some manufacturing coming back to the United States. Their markets, the 95% of the world that don't live in the United States. And that's where the real growth is occurring in the economy internationally.
Just a couple quick thoughts. First of all, I think when I think of services, I first think of insurance services and financial services and that like. And it's very difficult for us to be involved in export unless the country involved has the legal and the regulatory framework for us to be able to go over there and operate. So I think there's some restraint in the market because of that. But it's like anything else. If this is a little bit away from global leadership, but again, it's about when you take a look at a region or a country, do they have the rule of law, the transparency, et cetera, not just for services, but for manufacturing and everything else. That's one of the reasons that, frankly, when you think about investing overseas, if you're a small or medium-sized, or any size company, you're not going to put your dollars in a country that is politically unstable. And one of the advantages of, and again, one of the goals of the Global Leadership Group is to use the wise arsenal of liberty, particularly diplomacy and development assistance, to create more stable environments so then those exports can follow. Exports, to a certain extent, I guess there'll always be military exports to unstable parts of the world, but you're certainly not going to export other things to that part of the world. You're not going to get too much investment over there. So it's really about the rule of law, transparency, and the combination of diplomacy and development assistance. I want to make one real quick comment. I forgot to say this in my remarks, but I think it's very important, if you don't mind. President Carter did something really rather remarkable, I thought, at the dedication of President Bush's library. Here's former President Carter. And it was interesting how in his tribute to President Bush, he said, "President Bush, do you remember, shortly after you were elected, I came to you and said there was a civil war in Sudan. And I said, we need to do something about it because you know how important Africa is to me, personally, and it is to America. You said, see me in a couple weeks, we'll work on it. He said, I came back to see you. He said, you appointed a special envoy. You used all the diplomatic tools available, and a couple years later, there was a ceasefire and the civil war ended. He said, at the same time, Mr. President, you've invested in PEPFAR. There are 5 million people who have been treated in Africa whose lives have been saved because of immunization against, the work against AIDS. There are about 40% less deaths in Africa because vaccinations against malaria. You have diplomacy, and you have the development assistance. And when it was all said and done, he turned to President Bush and he said, thank you for keeping your word. But a graphic example of diplomacy and development assistance making a difference to that part of the world, but made a big difference to the former President of the United States, and he talked about it publicly. It's exactly what global leadership's all about. Diplomacy, development assistance.
Hey, John, can I tell a quick Las Vegas story
Of
on
course.
exporting services? And it was in the paper here maybe a month ago. But Tate Snyder is a medium-sized architectural firm here in Las Vegas. Done great work here. A couple of years ago, they received a STEP grant, which is a state trade and export program. It's federally funded. It goes through our office to pay half of their cost of going to China and being connected with some potential clients in China. They'll tell you they wouldn't have gone without that federal money helping pay for that trip and the government connections that it provided. When we went on the trade mission then to China 6 months ago, they were able to announce that they are now the architect of record for 2 800-foot tall towers near Shanghai. That's what really needs to happen. If somebody wants to export a service, they need to give us a call, let us know that they'd like to do that, and we'll help connect them. But it has to happen company by company, and we can help make that work.
By getting the word out and being able to connect with some of these small businesses. An additional success story, there's a design firm here in town called Todd Avery Lenahan Design, TA Design. They do work all over the world, but they're based in Las Vegas. They employ people here. And just like the architectural firm, they're getting contracts in China, in the South Pacific, in Latin America, and everything happens in Las Vegas. And that's a service. That's an export service. In the gaming industry, we have companies that excel in that trade, and they export their services as well. So along with tourism and mining, I think professional services of that nature are some of the leading exports that Nevada can develop.
It's interesting, this question, and anyone can jump in on this, the emphasis on China and Asia has been talked about by Secretary Ridge and by some of the panelists here, but here's an interesting question. Given the economic growth, potential natural resources, and political volatility in that region, why are we not equally focused on Africa? Who wants to take that one on?
Well, it's been a missed opportunity for decades, and we're still not focused in on it. And it's a shame. We're focused in on it from a military point of view. You got AFRICOM. We're focused in on it because given the unstable nature of some of those countries, it can become a hotbed for terrorism and other. But frankly, again, it's global leadership, and it's about our national leaders choosing where they're going to point the emphasis. And I'm just saying that there's been a big shift to Asia, but I think we have missed the boat in 2 parts of the world. We still don't pay enough attention to South America. Not even close, and we're not paying enough attention. 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in Africa. It's a matter of priorities, and right now the country is looking in the wrong direction, in my judgment. I can't give you an explanation other than I think we're really missing some really big opportunities.
I think Governor Ridge is right. Part of it, I think, is our ability to concentrate. I mean, historically we were Eurocentric, the special relationship that we had with Britain. Now, into the 21st century, the focus is China, what's happening. We've got to now shift and pivot. And as a result of that, I think, as Governor Ridge has indicated, we simply have ignored and haven't focused the kind of attention that we should. If you ask the average American, I don't think they would say, oh, Africa's where the real opportunities are. I think they would say, God, what's happening in Asia? What are the Chinese doing? What are we doing to protect our national interest, our economic interest? Are we going to be, in the mid-21st century, a second-rate power compared to the Chinese? Nobody talks much about Africa, but there's enormous opportunities, as the governor's indicated, with the growth of those economies.
Yeah. We got to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time as a country.
Yeah.
And we get so fixated on 1 or 2 things. And It goes back to where the Global Leadership Coalition is all about. I mean, some of this foreign aid will end up going into to Africa, but I think we're really missing huge opportunities. But for the exploration of natural resources over there, there's a lot of natural gas, a lot of oil. There's very little business engagement over there, and frankly, if there was a place where we needed to build stable governments, try to develop the rule of law, but begin taking care of the great human needs, it's the continent of Africa. I mean, it's a missed opportunity, and we're going to regret it if we don't wise up.
John, it does take a little bit of time to develop these relationships as well. Last week at the Insight Conference, Assistant Secretary of Commerce Michael Camuñas addressed the importance of dealing with Africa and creating trade with Africa because of the natural resources and others. There's also a very fast-growing market in certain African countries that are looking for American goods. The challenge, of course, is being able to get on that side of the world. Then when you compare that to the access to Latin American countries, might be a little bit more practical for American companies. So the idea is to focus on what's going to give you sometimes the fastest and the biggest return on your investment. But then again, we go to Colombia and we have situations like what happened there last year. But the good thing is that we're opening and signing trade agreements with a lot of Latin American countries. Again, like I mentioned earlier, some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Latin America. Yep.
Well, what about you, Mr. Hill? Africa, South America on your radar screen at all and what you're trying to do for the state?
Well, as a matter of fact, we have 4 people in international trade office at the state level, which is quite a bit less than the folks in Pennsylvania have. But folks in Pennsylvania really are a model on how to do this, and they've been a lot of help to me personally. But of those 4, right now, one of them is in Brazil, one of them's in Mexico today. And it's, I think, Nevada's first official trip to Brazil, and maybe ever, I don't know. And the reason that we're there is that there are 4 companies in Nevada that have found opportunities that in Brazil that help us open the door, and we can help them open the door for them while we're there. We can grow from there. But Ramon's right. We're trying, with 4 people, we're trying to seize on the opportunities that are in front of us, make something happen, grow credibility in the process, and then potentially be able to grow our efforts from there. But we have to develop some credibility that we're not just taking trips around the world, that this actually produces jobs in Nevada. And so that's the original focus, or the main focus now.
Governor Ridge, I think Steve Hill is very subtly suggesting you call Governor Sandoval and get his budget increased the way it's like in Pennsylvania.
I didn't want it to be too subtle.
I know we're running out of time, so let's conclude with this question, because I think it'll give you a chance to reaffirm the major goals of the coalition. Here's the question. How can U.S. global leadership be instituted as a national priority that can be insulated from the shifting winds of politics and other miracles? Governor Ridge, you want to take that on
Boy,
first?
everybody jumped all over to answer that one, didn't they? I think given the what people perceive to be as austere times, and if you're unemployed, it is austere, but I just think it's like anything else within the world of government and politics these days. It takes a persistent, sustained effort to educate, to proselytize not only the general public, but members of the House and the Senate. There's no substitute for the companies that have engaged in part of global leadership to be taking that message, no substitute for financial support for the coalition. It'll never be insulated. Nothing, actually, when you think of sequestration, nothing's insulated. Fortunately, this budget this year, at least President Obama's budget, I think is fairly close to last year's, even though there had been a previous reduction of several $billion. So I don't think it's any different than any other line item in the budget. Good times or bad, there'll always be some political resistance to foreign aid. Oh my God, we have all these problems here. How can we spend that money overseas? And I guess the answer's got to be, the refrain has to be repeated over and over again. It's a strategic investment in the best long-term interest of the United States of America and future generations. That's all you can do. Persistence and sustained messaging.
Well, let me let you jump in here, Mr. Hill. I mean, you know, some people, I don't know who they might be in the media, might criticize you for taking these trips overseas, for sending people to Brazil. Oh, there goes another junket, you know, paid for. How do you and the governor get the message out to folks in Nevada that this is an important role of government here?
Well, I think to start with, it goes back to what Secretary Ridge said. When you know it's the right thing to do, you're just going to have to go do it for a while. There are going to be some in the media that criticize that. And it has to produce results. You have to be able to point at something. You have to be able to tell Tate Snyder type stories that show that this was an investment that paid off much more than the original cost. Honestly, at this point, we're spending very little state money on that. The federal government does help quite a bit with those trade missions. So there's not, at this point, not a significant state investment in doing this. There's an investment of time and the people involved. But you have to develop the credibility and jump off and make sure that it happens.
Can I just add a sidebar? We had one reporter in the state capitol who was pretty critical, and we said, "You think this is fun? Come on down." We ran his buns off for 3 days. The second night, we were still out doing work. He was sleeping. I mean, if you're serious about a trade mission, it is hard work. And the men and women who leave their families and their companies to go to try to sell and to build relationships, they're not there partying, they're not fraternizing, they're not roaming around, they're working hard. And so I can't believe that you have newspapers that criticize what you're doing. Never happened in Pennsylvania.
Mr. Hill, I'm waiting for the invitation.
You got to pay your own way.
We're headed to China in about 3 weeks. You like to go?
As long as the legislature's done.
Yeah.
John, at two levels here, it seems to me that the one asset that is brought to the table in this increasingly adversarial, polarized political world, it's a world which, whether you're to the left of Mao Zedong or to the right of the Sheriff of Nottingham, has been terribly destructive in terms of the national political dialogue. But when you've got every former living Secretary of State as part of this group, that brings a lot to the table. And I think that sometimes we don't use that. We all in this room, after hearing the governor's keynote address and the other comments, not everybody gets that message. Not everybody knows that. The second thing, in terms of how do we get this message across more effectively, the governor has the bully pulpit. That's obviously a Theodore Roosevelt quote. But the governors can only do a limited amount. In other words, when you get elected governor, you want to change Western civilization as it has been known because of the priority that you have. It's important for the governors to identify the priority and repeat that message over and over again. When I was elected, we were in an economic recession, not anywhere near as devastating as the one that we've currently experienced. And so I was constantly talking about economic development. My staff said, people are sick and tired of hearing about that. Largely, I'm sure, because of my ineffective communication ability. We did a survey. Nobody identified economic development as a priority that I had. You've got to do time and time again make that point.
All right, Mr. Torres, I'm going to let you have the final word. You have three essentially members of the public sector here, at least were at one time. How does the private sector get this message across? How do you, who are obviously a big proponent of global leadership and exporting business and America's image in the world, how do you go about telling your colleagues in the private sector, how do you send that message?
I think Governor Ridge said it best. It's consistent messaging. It's all about the branding. It's about letting people know that you're open for business. And so when you go to countries like Costa Rica, that's the business center of Central America and the Caribbean, they get funding from Europe because Europe needs them as a source for goods and maybe a market for some other exports as well. As a net importing community, Las Vegas, the U.S. also imports quite a bit of what we need. So we need to have those strategic relationships where that's where organizations like the Global Leadership Council Coalition come in. We need to develop those relationships. We need to put our brand out there. We need to build that relationship. Business isn't done with a business card. It's done face to face. It's done person to person. And a great example of that is the success that the LVCVA has had in the last couple of years in opening new markets. We are now, I think, just behind Google as a recognized brand around the world. We need to capitalize on that. If we see the success that the LVCVA has had, yes, they spend a lot of money in what they're doing, but look at the success we've had. And I think we need to capitalize on that. We need to build a relationship. I think that's where it starts.
Well, let's use that to conclude and say, and hope that what happens here does not stay here in this room. Export the message of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition everywhere. And let's give a round of applause for these gentlemen for this great panel.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists, to our moderator for a really fascinating and compelling panel. I really enjoyed it, so thank you so much. Another thank you to our wonderful co-sponsor for today, the Latin Chamber of Commerce under the leadership of Oda Morita. We've enjoyed working with you so much. You're a wonderful organization in Las Vegas, and we appreciate your partnership. So as I did not mention before, my name is Megan Nathan. I know many, if not most of you in this room, and I'm our Western Regional Outreach Director. So my boss, our executive director, Liz Schreier, likes to say the difference between a good meeting and a great meeting is what happens next. So in order for it to be a great meeting, I really need your help. And it's just a few simple things, not a lot of time. The first thing, if you signed up through our website, you should be receiving an email in your inbox in the next couple minutes, maybe even right now. And it asks you for 3 things that we really would appreciate you doing. The first is we want you to tell us your story. How does this issue impact you? What resonated with you in the panel today? We really want to collect stories and be able to tell what we're doing in a compelling way. The second is for you to get someone else involved. Point us in the direction of your neighbors, of your coworkers who might be interested in this issue. We're always looking to expand our work in Nevada and across the West, so please help us in that. And then the last thing, you have a very dedicated and engaged congressional delegation, many of whom are represented here today. So please let them know that this is an issue that's important to you, because we can't do the work that we do in Washington, D.C. unless they're hearing from you here in the state of Nevada. So each of you should have on your table this Take Action card, and it actually, you can disattach the bottom, fill it out, either hand it to a staff member or leave it on the table. And then please take the top so that you have my information and you're able to reach out, get involved, come to our programs, and hopefully join us in Washington, D.C. Just next month from June 25th to 26th for our annual conference. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a wonderful day.